Welcome to the ultimate guide to your understanding of the complex scaling of Bleach. The first half of this video will dive into the Bleach source material, such as the databooks and manga. However, if you want to get right into the thick of it, the second half will dive into the scaling of the Bleach verse, where I'll be joined by other scalers to give you a decisive conclusion on Bleach's cosmology, attack potency, and even speed. For your convenience, timestamps will be included so you can easily jump to your favorite sections. This video is all about accuracy, and analysis that can set the record straight on Bleach's power scaling, and just before we get into it, there will be spoilers up ahead. So without further ado, Chapter 1 Death and Strawberry of Bleach actually gives us way more information about Soul Reapers and about the verse than most may think. We're of course introduced to the fact that Ichigo can see the souls of the departed spirits. More scalers will be familiar with this scan where it showcases that Rukia is surprised that Ichigo can see her and even more touch her, showing that Soul Reapers are intangible and invisible to people who do not have spiritual powers of any sorts. Between chapters 2 to 36, we learn that Soul Reapers can make a reishi footing in the sky, we get our first look at Hell, we see our first look at Hueco Mundo, we get our first context to universe and stuff being universes, and a bit of Buddhist context in the sense that hollows were once humans, which will go through the whole cycle of samsara. The next 20 chapters of Bleach really start to ramp up the scaling we see in the show. Starting off with the Quincy, Uryu, and Menos Grande part where they talk about the destruction of the universe. And this isn't just mentioned once, Rukia proceeds to say it 2 more times later on, specifically universe. Now moving on to the most important part of the Substitution Ingami arc in terms of scaling. The Cero light speed argument. It suggests that Ceros at a baseline speed must be light speed because in the databooks it states that they are spiritual light fired by Menos Grande and Arrancars. What would usually be a very valid debunk is saying that it states spiritual light and so therefore it wouldn't be photonic light and therefore it would not be light speed. It also goes into effect that the light of Ceros doesn't actually behave like actual light, like look at the way it bounces off Ichigo. But there is a huge flaw in all of these arguments. People use these arguments don't take into account that light can be manipulated around spiritual pressure, but they also don't take into account that Kishi and Reishi are parallel of each other, which means if you can have a normal building in the world of the living, you must be able to have a normal building built of Reishi in the Soul Society, so spiritual photons would work the exact same way as physical photons. And to further solidify this point, there are multiple occasions where Ceros are just straight up called light, not spiritual light. So I think it's safe to say that Ichigo here is at least relativistic in light speed, as the Gillian already shot and the beam of light was past halfway down his body by the time Ichigo reacted. Another hint that this all takes place within our universe, they actually talk about a band that exists within our own universe, Coldplay. And though this doesn't outright prove that it's a universe, it does give more context for things later on in the video. And the last part of the Substitution Ingami arc, the training with Urahara and Ichigo. This is where we learned that Bleach has a Zenkai type of system where you get stronger when you get into a near-death situation. Let's move on to the Soul Society arc. The Soul Society arc starts off by showcasing us the introduction of the Senkaimon and Dangai. This specific one also has a spirit particle conversion machine because Reishi and Kishi can now exist at the same time in the Soul Society. This is also explained by the fact that if the Soul Society and World of the Living collide and mix particles, that they would both immediately get annihilated. Then we get introduced to the Dangai, which looks like a corridor with thick wool surrounding it and further space in the distance. And a very important statement from Yoruichi comes out that says that it takes 10 days to walk from one gate to another in the Soul Society. Next up we have the most important panel for all the power scaling in Bleach, Chad cannot lose. When there's a huge gap between spiritual pressures, the one that's smaller will actually take damage rather than the one that's bigger. Then we have the flash step battle between Yoruichi and Byakuya, where Yoruichi uses Utsusemi, a technique where it leaves an illusion behind that can last several seconds and even appear damaged. Leaving an illusion that lasts several seconds like that from just purely your speed is easily FTL or FTL+. We later learn the actual difference between Shikai and Bankai in terms of combat capabilities, and this can range between strength, speed, or anything like that. It's anywhere from 5 to 10 times. Yoruichi also goes through a time discrepancy when they traveled through the Dangai between the World of the Living and Soul Society. This gives us an idea of how they're 2 different space times, and it clearly demonstrates that in the drawings, because Kubo clearly illustrates the 2 different lines as 2 separate time axes, not the same one, the Sogyoku. To understand the Sogyoku, you have to know what is a lie and what isn't within Aizen's letter, as it is of course made to misguide Hinamori, but it does not mean entirely that everything he said is wrong. For example, he stated here the execution has been contrived so that something may be stolen, which is entirely true, proving that this letter actually does have a lot of truthfulness to it as well. More truths we see in the letter is how the Sokyoku works and how powerful it is, which never gets retconned further down the line. This information includes it being able to increase its power by several dozen times when it's fully released. All of this information should also point towards this statement being true, where Aizen says that Soul Reapers below the rank of captain have never really been executed by the Sokyoku. So there's zero reason to doubt that the Sokyoku could not destroy the entire Soul Society if a person deemed it to do so. The narrative and context all points towards the direction of this being true and not just one of Aizen's misguided lies. His misguided lies would be saying that Toshiro wants to do this, but saying that it's unable to even happen would be totally headcanon. Let's talk about Tosen's backstory and how stars are in multiple panels. And I mean like way more than even 3 and 4. You have this one here with the title of Bleach in it as well, which even refers to them as stars. Clear indications that this is way more than just a planet. Going back to the Sokyoku, we have Ichigo stopping the Sokyoku, which shocks multiple captains, further proving the validity of what I said before about the Sokyoku. Ichigo blitzing 3 lieutenants, Sasakibe and Omaeda, who should be fast off Shuhei and Rangi, who dodged a beam of light, the Negacion. The anime shows Shuhei dodging the light as it hits the ground, literally starting to move when the light's practically in his face, which would make him FTL. But I'm gonna say his light speed because animes and animations in general like adding anticipation as something's about to move. But I have to prove the Negacion's actually light speed before we actually use these as a concrete argument. In the Soul's Databook, which is confirmed by Kubo to be canon, when citing the Negacion, it calls it light 3 times within the paragraph, and specifically referring to it as a beam of light. Some people try to debunk this by saying that light can't literally rip the ground out from your feet, but we already have showcases of spiritual pressure being enveloped in light before that I showcased before in the video, in Ceros. So it makes no sense why this wouldn't be the exact same case because it's coming from the exact same source. Therefore bringing us to the conclusion that Ichigo here must be at least FTL or FTL plus because the pedals will be moving at baseline minimum light speed, but it could even be higher than this because of just how many pedals there were. Moving past the Soul Society arc, we get onto the Soul's Databook, which had some scans we already talked about before, such as the parallel world scan I use when talking about spiritual light. It contains some interesting information about the Kototsu, otherwise known as the Cleaner, and also adds another light speed fee, as Urio's arrows when he took off the glove were moving at light speed, and we saw Mayuri actively dodge these arrows. The Databook also likens Ichigo's and Byakuya's speed to lightning. Keep in mind, like/liken can mean a comparison, so it does not mean it is. Now let's move on to the Arrancar saga, starting off with the invasion arc. Yami fights Urahara and talks about balas, which are 20 times faster than Ceros. 20 times Ceros would be 20 times light speed, so FTL plus. And we see Urahara casually dodge this. Moving on to Hueco Mundo, Neliel mentions that Los Noches' gate is only a 3-day walk from where they are. In chapter 262, we get a clear image of there being stars in Hueco Mundo. Arrancar dodging light is not actually that much of a valid feat, he's just moving before the rubble actually falls to the ground. During Ichigo's fight with Grimmjow, we get news about the Gran Rey Cero, which should never be used beneath the canopy of Los Noches by any espada. The reason for this is because the Gran Rey Cero distorts space. I'm not too knowledgeable in space distortion calcs, however I can comfortably say that this image shows us more of an arc radian rather than an arc degree. A Scalar versus Battle blog scaled this from about low planetary to about star level. I looked at other people's opinions on this and I looked through other blogs and forums, and it comes out to the conclusion that this might be one of the most consistent scales for Grimmjow's Gran Rey Cero and the best ones that you could find anywhere. Also, according to this scale, it's more likely to be in the higher ranges of small star to star level rather than any of the planet levels, so I'm going to comfortably scale this feat, let's say star level for now. The Gambinos Nudo is so fast, just changing the way you step can actually make almost perfect double kangas of yourself that is slightly different. Zumari himself can make up to 5, which is easily a light speed feat. These are light speed and not something like high hypersonic or something like that, because he can actually talk or the double kangas stay up. This means the light is reflecting off of his previous position or very easily FTL+. Later on we see Zumari stab Byakuya, and he thinks he sees the actual Byakuya for about this long. 10 seconds. Byakuya seems as if he's still standing there for 10 seconds to Zamari. The light from Byakuya had to be bouncing off for 10 whole seconds of him not being there. This is a clear indication of a light speed feat, and maybe the most concrete FTL plus feat we've seen so far. In this panel we see Zamari talk about subjugation, we see the moon, the sun, and stars. Arnold stated his ability can create endless soldiers, and it's also stated that Hueco has infinite reishi, making it infinite in size. Vaster Lord Ichigo proceeds to overpower Ukiura Cero Oscuras, which Cero Oscuras is stated to be an order of magnitude stronger than a regular Cero, meaning Ichigo must be over 10 times stronger than Ukiura, at least in attack potency right here. I think it's quite obvious that Lanza de Rabago is a stronger attack than Cero Oscuras, and Ichigo Cero can also blow that away, since Kubo said that the start of Hellverse was actually a very accurate representation of how he would have liked the fight to be. Moving to the world of the living, where Fate Karakura Town is, we have probably one of the worst mistranslations for debunking lightspeed feats. This Reddit user says it best, but I'll also explain other reasons why there's no point of arguing this point. There's already enough concrete lightspeed feats. Gin actually says the wrong name of his Zanpakuto multiple times to misdirect people. He blatantly says that he lied about its speed and capabilities to Aizen, which if you're lying to somebody you want to kill, you'll probably lowball your actual abilities. In Bankai, Ichigo is already multiple times faster than Gin's Bankai, and let that alone, he has holifications. There was no reason for him to be shocked other than the interpretation shown by the Reddit user above, who is suggesting that the clap itself, like the actual motion of the clap, was what Gin was referring to, not the sound that came from it. Baragon states that the sun and the stars are all insignificantly small to him. When Komamura thinks that Tozen is suggesting to use Bankai, Tozen says not to make him laugh, as Aizen has given him a greater power, which is holification, which clearly shows that holification is more powerful than Bankai. Moving on to the Dangai. The Dangai is cut off from the world of the living, the Soul Society, and even from time and space. Yet, the Dangai has its own time axis and even has spatial entities within it, meaning it has its own spatial axis as well. Therefore, if it's cut off from all of these things, but it has all of these other things, it means it has to be a separate space-time continuum, meaning an entire universe is separating the world of the living and the Soul Society. Now to end off the Arrancar saga. Hado 90 distorts space to the likes so that Kurosaki can never imagine, when he's already seen a Grand Racer distort space at a star level. Therefore, Hado 90 should be able to distort space at an even greater level than a star, so we can argue that this is at least large star, but we can also argue it's multisolar to galaxy because it could be at the level of a relatively decently sized black hole. Ichigo proceeds to evolve to a level far beyond this, which makes it possible to argue this Ichigo in the universal plus ranges. However, we're not going to do that right now. Moving straight onto the Masked Databooks, which cover these segments of the story, the Masked Databook refers to the world of the living and Soul Society as two separate parallel universes, existing independently of each other. This is also why I got my source for the spiritual light scanner I referenced in the start of the video. And now moving on to the Unmasked Databook, the Kotsutsu is stated to control time and space, and in other translations stated to even govern it, with his powers even surpassing reason, which, as I interpreted before, I believe means that it's above just being one race. The Databook also confirms a lot of the information about the Dangai I used earlier to prove it's a separate space-time. The Databook refers to Stark Zeros as flashes of light. The Databook also refers to Gin's sword abilities as lies. Moving past those Databooks and onto Spirits are Forever With You, which takes place between the Arrancar arc and the Fullbring Arc. We get our first information on the Garganta that it fills all the space between the Soul Society, Hueco and World of the Living. This is confirmation that the Muken is actually located within the actual Serete as a pocket dimension rather than actually being a separate space. As a Shiro who can actually feel people's spiritual pressure because he's connected to the surroundings, he still thought that Squad Zero could be Aizen. This clearly puts Squad Zero above Monster Aizen. And the reason for my certainty is because as a Shiro sensed Squad Zero's power before, so you'd know how both would match up against each other. Seeing Gran's spiritual pressure exceeds that of Yami Largo, known as the strongest espada with the number 0, this clearly shows us the sign Grans is currently the strongest espada we ever knew of. Time passes very differently in the Garganta, clearly proving that it has a separate time axis, making it a whole other separate space-time, as we know that it holds all the realms, so it makes sense that it has its own time axis as well. Azashiro confirms that there is absolutely no Kishi in the Soul Society, as he was able to fuse with the Serete much easier than he has time doing with the Karakura Town because it has Kishi. Zaraki unleashes a large attack rate and a big crack between the World of Living and Garganta. He actually unleashes multiple attacks that cause cracks between the World of Living and Garganta, however there's one key point here. Nothing here, either the top or bottom paragraph or anything to do with cracks between the World of Living and Garganta scales either Zaraki, Azashiro, Sign, or anybody, anyone how relative to them from here on out to the Garganta. All they are doing is cracking the boundary between the Garganta and World of the Living. What that means is that they are cracking the world of the living itself. They're not damaging the Garganta, they are only damaging the world of the living, the actual membrane of it. Which, if I put it in a different perspective, imagine you have two marbles floating inside a bottle and you damage one of the marbles. That is what they are doing. They are damaging the outer shell of one of those marbles, not the bottle itself. Which, if you want to argue 4D because they are affecting the space-time and the outer shell and all of that, you can do that. Anyways, moving on to the Fullbring Arc. This takes place almost a year and a half after Aizen's defeat and Ichigo can no longer see ghosts. The Bleachverse also has stuff like Tekken on top of Coldplay that I mentioned earlier, which still proves that it's more likely a replica of our literal universe. Fullbringers are normal humans, but they can manipulate souls on a much different level to any other race. They can literally manipulate the actual soul living in things, as souls are located in everything, and this means they can actually connect to some items so they have better bonds with those items, able to unleash their Fullbring better. The Fullbring Arc also references spirits are forever with you, proving that it's actually canon events that happened. Whenever Ichigo touched his deputy badge after a battle, the deputy badge carved the memories of the battle onto its soul. Kinjo states that once he completes Fullbring, it will naturally fuse with his Soul Reaper powers, giving him powers beyond the Soul Reaper. And just like Rukia transferred her Soul Reaper powers into Ichigo, the following people transferred their Soul Reaper powers into Ichigo this time. Every single lieutenant and captain within the entire Gotei 13, on top of Yoruichi, Urahara, Ishin, and Hanataro. Yukio's dimension appears smaller than it actually is inside, which clearly showcases that it's a proper pocket dimension where the physical barrier on the outside is smaller than the barriers on the inside. Ichigo breaks this dimension, which means that his power far exceeds Ginjo's and Yukio's combined. It doesn't mean that all the other people there don't, it just means that they individually don't, meaning that Ichigo is above any of them individually at the very least, but I'd argue that he's above all 5 or 6 of them. The Soul Society is stated to have at least 1,000,000 years of immutability, which means that Soul Reapers have existed for at least 1,000,000 years. Update got a new mic, but let's move on to the 1,000-year Blood War arc. While Soul Reapers cleanse Hollows and send them to the Soul Society, Quincy's kill Hollows and extinguish their souls completely. What this means is that the world of the living will constantly have an increase of souls, which would one day break the equilibrium, causing the Soul Society to flow into the world of the living and collapse in both universes simultaneously. The combined strength of Squad Zero is said to be greater than that of the 13 Court Guard squads before the second invasion. Ichigo, after his hot spring buff, showed relative to Squad Zero's strength after taking what I just said into account. It really puts into perspective how much stronger he got as he reflectively fractured Tenjiro's wrists the moment he took the blow. And if that wasn't enough of a buff, Hikifune gave him a whole nother dimension worth of power with her Gikon food. Whether you take it literally or as a metaphor, it's still a big buff. Then we move on to Unohana's encounter with Kenpachi in the Muken, which he states is infinite in the anime. In the manga it got mistranslated to almost infinite, but we clearly see with the translations I provided that it does mean infinite. The Databook also points towards this, as well as the Con for Your Own World of Light novels in volume 3, pages 248-251. The version of Ichigo in screen far surpasses any previous form of his that we've seen so far, and this baseline scales him galaxy, but much higher from what I'm going to say further down the line. The Vandenreich is located within the Serete. In fact, it is actually located on the same coordinates as the Serete within the Soul Society itself. This, to my knowledge, is called a spatial coordinate coexistent, and the higher dimensional properties required for something like this to happen is supported by the fact that the Vandenreich can contain infinite power. The meteor does not scale to a meteor, it scales to Gremmy's imagination, just as he directly stated to us as the viewers. This is further implied by him not even being 100 times stronger when he created outer space to trap Kenpachi in it. For those who think that he did not create outer space, the author notes of the Blu-ray version of 1,000-Year Blood War Court 2 directly state that he created outer space, and the manga illustration of Kubo after the chapters also confirms that Grammy can literally imagine and create outer space. It is illustrated to us. This just makes Kenpachi seem so much stronger because Granby could imagine Kenpachi's power. He could perfectly imagine his power and was able to comprehend it to its entirety, yet his power was still not strong enough to create a vessel strong enough to harbor all of that power. He created his own vessel to be able to imagine, but that shows that Kenpachi's power literally surpassed his ability to imagine. And considering the probably multiple galaxies shown within Remy's space that he created, this easily scales both of these characters to multi-galaxy. Masked Masculine states that his hero's beam is a beam of light, and we see Renji casually deflect it, showcasing light speed feats even to this point. On multiple occasions, it's stated that if Reo was to be killed or destabilized or taken out as the linchpin for the entire cosmology, that everything would cease to exist. The Soul Society, Huecomundo, Dangai, everything, even including the Garganta, which is stated by Ganyu, who was in the Garganta at the time, would all cease to exist. Yoruichi, smash. gives us a better explanation of how the cosmology works on a more concrete scale, where the Garganta envelops and fills the spaces between everything and holds everything within it, including the Valley of Screens, World of the Living, Hueco Soul Society, and even Dangai, which makes it even more impressive when somebody like Ukitake comes out of his way and combines with Mimihagi through the Kamikake to literally hold this entire cosmology, and even crazier when yhwach absorbs the entirety of Ryo himself, who was holding it previously. yhwach at the end of the manga was going to use this Ryo to pull together the entire cosmology of Bleach. At the end of every single one of these chapters near the end of the manga, Kubo illustrates the entire universe being pulled apart and reshaped and everything sinking into despair. This both proves that these are universes and also proves that these characters actually do scale to these sizes in Cosmos. Kubo supervised the 1000-year blood walk, and there are some feats in it that are very important. But just before we get into the feats, proof that he did actually supervise is the fact that he's been very heavily involved within the anime and has been actively changing things happening. He is even the general supervisor of it, as shown in the Core 3 intro. The Triplets World Scan showcase within the anime is actually some of the most concrete proof that we have that the 3 realms and the entire cosmology is indeed universes in their own rights. This is pointed towards with the Primordial Sea statement within the scan itself, where it talks about how the Soul Society, Hueco and World of the Living were separated from the Primordial Sea. This becomes important when you look at the Buddhist context surrounding Bleach. The Primordial Sea or Ocean of Water represents the vastness and beginning of creation, which can also refer to the cosmology and also the renewal and cleansing of souls, both seen in the cycle of Samsara I mentioned earlier in the video, and the Bleach Konpaku cycle, clearly indicating the realms are bigger than just planets. The keywords page for Senjumaru states that her Shikai can stitch infinite spiritual threads that extend from her needlehead. Essentially, this means she has infinite ray arts and is able to affect infinite amounts of people at the exact same time. This just further solidifies her Bankai feat being able to shake the realms, as she already has infinite power. And to further solidify, when she states that she's going to shake the realms, she specifically refers to them as heaven and earth with the kanji tenshi, which usually means universe if you're looking back at Buddhist context. And now that I've covered all the source material I've been wanting to cover throughout this first part of the video, let's move on to part 2. Starting off part 2 will be scaling the cosmology, beginning with the 3 realms, and there's no better place to start than the Soul Society. To start off, Soul Society I've already explained as a universe, but for those who didn't watch part 1, Kaname Tosen's backstory showcases multiple stars in the sky and they actively talk about it. Yoruichi in the Soul Society also talks about the fact that the World of the Living and Soul Society are separate time axes, and while on topic, the World of the Living is called a universe multiple times before the Soul Society arc, and once we factor in the Soul's Databook statement that they're parallel worlds and the Mars Databook statement that they're parallel universes, it's quite obvious that both of these constructs, both the Soul Society and World of the Living, scale universal pluses 4D spacetimes. The Garganta has a separate time flow, and this separates the World of the Living and Soul Society and Hueco all from themselves, meaning that Hueco has to have its own time axis. Adding on to this fact, Hueco is always shown with infinite ratio and endless statements where it stands, and even if we don't include that, Hueco is also shown to have stars within it. This all points towards Hueco being another spacetime just like the World of the Living and Soul Society. This means that all 3 realms combined would equate to low multiversal or 2C. However, this is the baseline argument and the one that should be considered the minimum. If you want to go for any higher interps that could also be consistent, I'll hand that over to Shimo.
Thank you, Zach, for having me here. I'm Shimo. We must first address the fact that it is a macrocosm, which means it's something more complex than just your average space-time, at least in our case. When referring to the macrocosm, I will be referring to the realm. However, when referring to one of the dimensions in the macrocosm, I will be referring to it by the name, like the Soul Society, the Wandenreich, the Muken, or the Sulking Palace. For this scale, we won't be accounting for the Sulking Palace, as whenever it operates under the same principles as the former is a debate of its own. So we'll mainly bring out the Muken and the Wandenreich. The Wandenreich exists in the Soul Society's shadow. Since shadows don't actually possess a spatial capacity, we can rule out the idea that it actually exists in the shade. What are the facts we know? We know that it is a dimension created out of Rishi by the Quincy, Rishi being incredibly versatile as it makes up the space and time of different realms. For accounts to legate to actual cases with the Soul Society inside of the realm which are the hosts within it, the primary dimension of the Soul Society, it would at least need an additional axis to separate the Wandenreich and the Soul Society, as we know the overlap implication would don't share the same spatial fabric. This 5-dimensional axis wouldn't apply to dimensions in the realm and only to the realm's macrocosm, as it exists to dislocate them across the dimension that these spaces don't actually share. Take it as the Soul Society exists in coordinates z1, x1, yhwach, and the Wandenreich exists in the same coordinates, meaning they are separated by the 4th axis, for our sake called as variant coordinate between these constructs. This allows them to exist like flat pieces of paper lined up in parallel, which is necessary for the existence as shown. Now that the explanation for the Wonder March is done, where exactly does the Muken come in? The Muken has an infinitely stretching space, as is continuously stated both within the novels, databooks, the anime, and the manga. For an infinite space to coexist with the Soul Society, it just like the Wonder March would need to be separated because an axis it doesn't exist in, which only further proves a prior interpretation, mainly because unlike with the Wonder March, which its exact size is undefined, the Muken cannot be explained in such a manner, as it would simply make no sense for infinite space to coexist with another infinite space without excessive mention of a higher infinity. Thus, we follow the geometry.
If we follow Shimos' higher interpretation scale, this would scale the entire macrocosm of the Soul Society to 5D, being 4 spatial dimensions and 1 temporal dimension. And this guides us straight into our path to scale the Dangai, which I'll hand over to Misfits.
So first of all, I just want to say thank you to Zoki for having me on this video. I really do appreciate it. Well, at this point into the video, I'm pretty sure the spatial axis and temporal axis of the Soul Society has been covered by Shimo. My job is to simply go over the Dangai in this video, where it scales both high-end and low-end interpretations, but that is heavily contingent on Shimo's scale about the Soul Society. So the first thing is that we know that it separates the time axis of the Soul Society and the world of living, which means they cannot come into contact with each other. We also know that it possesses its own torrent of time, which in this case is 2 times more dense than original time, or just normal time, which means that it does possess its own axes. We obviously know that it does in fact has 3 dimensions like height, length, and width, which means it is a 4-dimensional space-time. Now obviously if you want to go for the more high-end with the term hyperspace, hyperspace does in fact mean in this case high-dimensional space, but you know, using that statement alone is very vague. The baseline of the Dangai is just 4-dimensional space-time. Now the high end of the Dangai is contingent on 2 things, the Regai arc being canon and the hyper timelines the Dangai possesses. We've thought of with the Regai arc being canon because we need this as a baseline for why this high interpretation exists in the first place. So the first thing we need to know is Project Spearhead was actually a project which was created by Squad Zero Kirefune Hikefune. Sorry if I butchered that name, but basically she was the one who started the entire idea of Gigai. So basically this is actually canon because it actually plays into the actual storyline. This took place between the Fake Kurodan arc and between the Fullbring Arc. This is consistent with the fact that it took place right after Ichigo lost his Soul Reaver powers, and this is contingent with the fact that in the arc actually Ichigo does in fact lose his powers because he was basically fading away. In the light novels, these characters actually existed because in Garfi's own world, Nozomi was mentioned as a character who existed because her Zanpakuto was mentioned, and it was mentioned that her Zanpakuto is the only Zanpakuto outside of a few other characters, which actually absorbs Reishi, which means that these characters weren't just filler, they actually existed in the canon timeline. It was being recognized in a canon arc, so yeah, it's very much canon. I'll be going over the temporal dimensions of the Dangai. To go over the temporality, we needed the Regai arc because there was a statement, if someone was absorbed by the cleaner, they can exist in no other time axis. This basically aligns with the fact that the cleaner
Don't let me leave, Murph!
cleaner in the Databooks governs over space-time, which also Ichigo in the arc saved himself from the past because he came from the future when entering the cleaner. This means that the cleaner is in fact its own entire space-time continuum without the Dangai's axis, which is where we have to go in depth explaining Dangai's hyper timelines. As much as I'm not a fan of using Versus Battle Wiki as a reliable source, I do agree with the explanation they give on how hyper timelines work. Essentially, think of a lesser timeline as one directional, yet it is still perpendicular to the hyper timeline, except its event that unfolds and affect the higher one. And think of the higher timeline as an axis which is just once again one directional, but instead it records both the events that unfold in its own axis and the cleaner's axis via the explanation of orthogonal timelines. This means that the Dangai is essentially a hyper timeline to the cleaner's axis, which is even more consistent with the fact that if Aizen were to destroy the cleaner, a new one would just come into existence, proving it's recording more than just one timeline's events. This means that the Dangai is a 2-dimensional temporal dimension, which makes it 3D space 2D time, or 4D space 2D time, which, as I mentioned in my segment, is very dependent on the spatial scale of the Soul Society presented earlier in the video.
Misfits' explanation of the Dangai brings his baseline scale of the Dangai to 4D or Universal Plus, and his high-end scale of the Dangai to 6D if supported by Shimo's scale, or 5D if not supported by Shimo's scale, easily scaling it low complex either way. Now moving on to the Kyogoku and Garganta, I will give it over to Gambino.
Yo, shout out to Zoki for bringing me on this. I just want to touch on the Kyogokus, which I think gets overlooked within Bleach's cosmology. This should help clarify the roles roles that both the Kyogoku and Garganta play within the Bleachverse. Kubo actually told us at the end of chapter 627 to rewatch Memories of Nobody. That, along with chapter 625 and 627 and the Can't For Your Own World novels, gives us a clear picture of what Kyogokus really are and how they function. They are independent dimensions or altered racy spaces that are scattered throughout the Garganta near the Dangai, and they are formed of lost souls who have been fallen out of the cycle of reincarnation, or soul reapers who got lost within the travel between worlds. Their size varies, as some of them are small as rooms, while other of them are large enough to destabilize the structure of the entire cosmology. From Mayuri's perspective in the Memories of Nobody movie, we see that the worlds aren't just planets in outer space, but they are self-contained realms floating within the Garganta. The scattered bubbles you see between them represent the Kyogoku, and when those bubbles expand or collapse, they directly affect the realms and pulling them closer into a collision. What is the Garganta? Well, Can't For Your Own World describes it as an endless expanse, and since it contains infinite 3D spaces with temporal axis attached to them as well, the Garganta must exist as a higher order of infinity, serving as the container of all realms both spatially and temporally. Every known location from the living world, Hueco Mundo, Dangai exists within that Garganta, so at minimum the Garganta is a 5D construct for encompassing all the lower dimensions. Depending on how those realms are scaled and factoring in Mayuri's statement that it holds complete dominion over time, space, and infinite dimensions, it could logically be interpreted as 6 to 7D.
Gambino's Garganta scale leads us to the conclusion of the Cosmology section, so let's start from the bottom. The story of Bleach primarily takes place across the three realms: the Soul Society, the World of the Living, and Hueco Mundo, and as I mentioned earlier, each realm has its own spatial and temporal axis, making them separate 4D spacetimes. The Dangai also qualifies as 4D as it's separate from the other realms spatially and temporally, but it has its own spatial and temporal axis, making it a unique 4D spacetime. Kyogoku can influence these realms in their dimension, meaning that they must be at least 4D themselves to affect them. The Garganta, which links all the realms transcending the limits of their spatial and temporal axes, makes it quantitatively and qualitatively superior. To illustrate, imagine this analogy. Imagine two 2D circles on a piece of paper in a 3D room, and a pen on the paper in one of those circles. Now move the pen from one circle to the other without drawing a line. You cannot. You'd have to bend the paper or lift the pen conforming to the 3D space in the room. This demonstrates that the Garganta operates in at least a 4D spatial axis. Furthermore, it also handles the time axes of the other realms, suggesting it could even be 5 or 60 in nature, especially when you handle in the fact that it has its own time axis. Thus, the Bleachverse scales at minimum 5D low complex multiversal, but more consistently to 60 complex multiversal due to its superiority over the realm's temporal dimensions. But this isn't where the verse caps. Shimo presents the 4D spatial argument for the Soul Society, suggesting that the only way the Muken and Wonderite can exist within its macrocosm is if it includes an extra spatial axis, thus making the Soul Society, the other realms, and the Dangai 5D constructs. This would push the Bleachverse to a baseline of 60, with the comfortable scale of 70 still being consistent. You can also reach this conclusion using Misfits' Dangai scale, which treats its temporal axis as 2D instead of the standard 1D. This will make the Dangai 5D and the Garganta encompassing both its spatial and temporal axis 6 to 7D. In the end, we have two consistent ways to scale the Bleachverse 6 to 7D using the source material. If both arguments are accepted altogether, the Garganta could even be considered 8D consistently, assuming our interpretations of the construct it contains are the most consistent there is to offer. In conclusion, the Garganta consistently scales at least 5 to 6D and can reasonably reach 7 to 8D if all interpretations hold, thereby making the Bleachverse complex multiversal. Using this, we can now move on to the attack potency of the Bleachverse. I'll start with the key feats to define Bleach's scaling, then align them to the Cosmology Scale, showing how characters fit into these tiers while staying true to the story's power system. In the Soul Society arc, Ichigo blocks the Sokyoku, which is not only able to destroy the Sedate, but the entire Soul Society as well. This is clearly referring to the planet due to it referring to the Sedate beforehand, though this does not refute its statements to overwhelm everything in existence, which can get Ichigo and everyone around his level way higher than planetary, especially when you consider that Shikai Ichigo is merely a fraction of what he becomes by the end of the Soul Society arc. The Arrancar arc, however, makes it extremely clear that these levels of power are no longer relevant, with Asashiro and Spirits of with you stating that Byakuya only beat Zamari because of his training between the arcs, indicating that he got much stronger after already being planet level. Though Ichigo's battle with Grimmjow set in stone the unimaginable jump in power between the arcs, when base Grimmjow used his Ground Ray Zero, an attack that creates a distortion of space that comfortably scales star level, a million times increase from the Sokyoku destructive statements, and this further solidifies Ichigo Hueco Mundo's shaken feat in his battle against Ulquiorra, which scales Ichigo's solar level plus, when considering the over 300 stars we see at the start of chapter 262. However, the scaling very quickly ramps up from the Fake Karakura Town arc onwards. If we follow Misfits' blatant proof of the cleaner having its own unique time axis, Aizen destroying the cleaner would easily scale 4D Universal Plus, then Ichigo completely overpowering this Aizen, and Aizen multiple forms above the version of himself that destroy the cleaner, easily scales both Universal Plus as a low ball, with the criteria for low multiversal being more consistent, especially when you take into account Azeshiro's statement in Spirits of Weather With You that suggests he expected Squad Zero to defeat Aizen. These are the same people who can threaten the destruction of the realms if even one of them go all out, as suggested by Oetsu and Senjumaru, which we'll say is low multiversal for the sake of the argument. This puts Ichigo, Aizen, and Squad Zero easily in the low multiversal ranges by the end of the Arrancar saga, with displays of power like the final Getsuga Tensho having low complex multiversal arguments, though even these monsters get completely power crept after the 2-year time skip, with multiple scans stating that Ichigo got all of his powers back when Rukia stabbed him, the entirety of his powers back. This is further emphasized by the manga showing Ginjo when it refers to Ichigo getting back the powers he used to defeat Aizen, and it's even further supported by the fact that Zangetsu, the controller of his powers up until now, stated that he never let Ichigo use more than a fraction of his power up until that point, which includes Dangai in his final Getsuga Tensho. In fact, Shikai Fullbring would be stronger than Mugetsu because Ichigo was in contact with his badge after the fight, meaning his Mugetsu powers seeped into his badge, which later he used to unlock his complete Fullbring, which fused with his Shinigami powers in Fullbring Shikai, which in the end gives us a Fullbring Ichigo being superior to his Dangai and Mugetsu self. Kubo didn't forget about Transcendence and the large gap of power, otherwise yhwach wouldn't have made his statement about Yamamoto's Bankai. It's just that everybody power crept to that level. This entire argument sets in stone that anybody on the level of Fullbring Shikai Ichigo scales low multiversal, which finally brings us to the staple of Bleach's power scaling. The 1000-Year Blood War, an arc that doesn't just deliver, it blows all expectations out of proportion, with the levels these characters reach by the end of the story. Though, let's start with the general high tiers before touching upon the literal gods of the verse. Grimmy created outer space with galaxies in Kubo's illustration. This is confirmed in Kubo's interviews found in the Blu-ray for 1000-Year Blood War. This same Grimmy is incapable of imagining a vessel that can hold Kenpachi's power, easily making Kenpachi multi-galaxy. Senjumaru states that the Blood Oath seals the power of the Squad Zero members because they would destroy the entirety of the 3 realms, proven by the kanji used, which scales low multiversal on the low end and low complex multiversal on the high end. So far this is highly consistent, as multiple feats suggest this caliber of power. Aizen destroying the Kototsu, Squad Zero threatening the realms, Kenpachi and Sign cracking the other living dimension, and Grimmjow's death threatening Huekomudu's existence. So I think it's time we conclude the power of the god tiers. Soul King Adonais acted as the linchpin to the entire Bleach multiverse, a corpse holding the fabric of at least 6 spatio-temporal dimensions, and yes, this includes the Garganta. Ichigo kills Adonais, and to further solidify equal power to Adonais, yhwach completely absorbs him. Well, if you still think this is inconsistent, Ichibe blatantly states that Ichigo has to bear the weight of everything he wants to protect, which is the multiverse when he does the Irizusando trial. The same trial used to test the power of a Soul King candidate, as Ichibe planned to make Ichigo replace Adonais as the linchpin of the Bleach multiverse if things took a wrong turn, and yet there's still more consistent proof with Ichigo one-shotting Prime yhwach not once, but twice. So to swiftly conclude the AP section, the god tiers of the Bleachverse casually scale to the complex multiversal ranges of power, ranging from 6D minimum to 8D max, with 7 being a reasonable mid-ball if you consider any of the high interpretation arguments we presented. And so with that out of the way, moving on to the speed of the Bleachverse, if you watch part 1, it's well established the verse is already at least light speed. If we look at the Substitute Shinigami arc and the Soul Society arc, we already know the Ceros are established to be baseline light speed and the Negacion is a beam of light. I also explained why it's dumb to argue that because it says spiritual light that you can disprove that it's not photonic light, because both Kishi and Reishi have the same properties and work the same way within the Bleachverse. And if you argue that the way they act and the way they move when they're being hit or collided with is a debunk to them being light, it's already stated that within the Bleachverse, Reiatsu is enveloped in light and therefore the light can be reshaped to whatever the Reiatsu is reshaped to. And this is all further solidified by the fact that Confio World states that Ceros are light multiple times. So going off this entire argument, let's look at some feats and some more statements that further solidify light speed Bleach since the Soul Society arc, such as Uru outspeeding his own shadow. If we divide his body length by the amount he would have moved off screen, which is 273 pixels divided by 533 pixels, which gives us a little over half the speed of light, which is relativistic plus. This becomes even more consistent when we take into account his Let Steel form, which is stated to have a light speed attack, and Mayuri was dodging arrows while he was in this form, which further increases the consistency of Lieutenant and Captain class Shinigami being light speed in the Soul Society arc. And this doesn't even include Ichigo's side of the story, where he's blitzing people who are faster than others who dodged literal light. Being subsonic or 6.86 times faster than a normal human's running speed makes you able to blitz a human, and if Ichigo is blitzing people that are literally moving at the speed of light, that makes them 6.86 times the speed of light. And if we just multiply this by 5 times for his Bankai, it gives us over 30 times the speed of light, and it would give us almost 70 times if we gave him the full Bankai multiplier. And before people say this is inconsistent because if Ceros are light speed, then why are these characters being hit by Ceros? Ceros are amped by the Reiatsu within them, which means they will move faster the stronger the person casting them is. This is very logical and gets rid of any inconsistencies to do with this topic. All of these blatant facts makes it very easy to get characters MFTO and above throughout the Arrancar and 1000 Year Blood War arc, and the best way to showcase this is through Ichigo, as it's probably not a surprise that the main character is a good point of reference for all other characters in the show, and since he comfortably scales FTO plus in his Bankai in the Soul Society arc, we can easily scale him MFTO with his Hollow Mask fully mastered after his Grimjaw fight. The reason I'm times that by 10 is because Tosen said that holification is greater than Bankai. This same Ichigo went from being blitzed by Ulquiorra to being comparable to an Ohana and Reiatsu even with less than a third of his power. If we take in the Zenkai amp he would have got from practically dying, I believe base Ichigo in the fake Karakura Town arc easily scales to Vastolorde if not even above it. So let's figure out how fast Vastolorde is. If Ichigo's Hollow Mask brings him anywhere between 343 times light speed to 686 times light speed, and he's still getting Perception Blitz by Ulquiorra's first release, and Ulquiorra's second release will be a minimum 2 times faster than this, overall Ulquiorra will be a minimum of 10 times faster than his masked Ichigo, at least over 3,400 times light speed. And keep in mind, this has so far been the lowest for the low balls. Vastolorde Perception Blitz this same Ulquiorra, meaning he was at least 5 times faster. Lowballing Vastolorde Ichigo's speed would still reach 15,000 times light speed. If Fake Karakura Town Bankai Ichigo has more Reiatsu than Vastolorde Ichigo, mostly due to him being in a near-death situation, or I guess quite literally dead, this means that Hollow Mask Ichigo with a nerfed mask would be at least 2 times faster or 30,000 times light speed. Ichigo is deep into the MFTO plus speeds even before getting into his Dangai form, a form which takes Ichigo from consistent solar ranges of power to universal plus levels. Though the part that really sets this in stone is Fullbring Shikai Ichigo, regaining all of that power beyond that of even Dangai, so to anyone arguing Bleach is not MFTO plus, anything below 30,000 times the speed of light Ichigo is a diabolical lowball. But let's stop with the lowballs. How fast would they be if we were more reasonable? Ichigo mastered his false Bankai with his fight against Byakuya, which would be a full 10 times multiplier, and Sasakibe is considered captain level, yet he is still getting Perception Blitz by Ichigo, and Sasakibe is multiple times faster than somebody like Shuhei or Rangiku who dodged the Negacion. You could argue Sasakibe, who is stated to be captain level, is 5 to 10 times faster than all the lieutenants, especially with the consistent emphasis on captains being majorly superior to lieutenants at this point in the story. So he's at least 5 times faster than any other lieutenant, meaning Ichigo in his Bankai is 5 times 6.86 times 10 the speed of light, or 343 times the speed of light in Bankai against Byakuya. Taking all of our previous Vastolorde calculations into account, Ichigo would be 3,430 times the speed of light with his Hollow Mask against Grimjaw, and taking into account the full Resurrection multipliers and the Perception Blitz multipliers from Ulquiorra, Ichigo in Vastolorde would be at least 1.6 million times the speed of light. This sets in stone that there is absolutely no way to scale any min to high tier in Bleach below MFTO plus after the Fullbring Arc. Now that we covered the cosmology, attack potency, and speed of the Bleach verse, time to bring it all together for the final conclusion. Throughout the video, we concluded that the Bleach cosmology scales anywhere from 6 to 8D, and that the god tiers of the Bleach verse scale to these tiers. Throughout the attack potency section, we concluded that there are consistent low multiversal to low complex multiversal feats from the high tiers, and consistent complex multiversal feats from the god tiers. Then finally in the speed section, we concluded that the Bleach verse scales very consistently MFTL, though I will say there are showcases of infinite speed feats, such as Senjumaru's Reiatsu Traverse in the Three Realms, so infinite speed can be a more conclusive and consistent argument for the higher god tiers of the verse. So in conclusion, we have the top tiers of Bleach such as Ichigo scaling complex multiversal, when MFTL plus to possibly infinite speeds, with the high to mid tiers ranging from universal plus to complex multiversal max, with low tiers naturally being much lower. This video was brought to you by not only me but multiple people, so it would be greatly appreciated if you like and subscribe and also follow everybody else involved. I've also just opened up a Patreon where you can follow any other projects I work on, so if you enjoy what I do here, supporting me on there would be greatly appreciated. If you'd like to watch me play any games, come follow me on Twitch. I'll be streaming the Arc Raiders launch live today, so come check that out if you're interested. And to close this off, give me your thoughts on Bleach's power scaling in the comments down below. Do you agree or disagree? Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.